One way of reflecting these two saints whose feast we celebrate today is to compare them insofar as the information about them given by the gospel accounts. That book, Acts of the Apostles. It is interesting to note that St. James was in charge of the so-called First Church Council in Jerusalem in the year 49 AD. While in the Gospels, hardly James was mentioned. No? The other James, of course, the inner circle, there are two James among the apostles of Jesus. But this James called the Lesser was not within the inner circle of the closest apostles of Jesus, Peter, James, and John. But this lesser, James the Lesser, was not very known, no, at least in the gospel. And it is interesting that after the resurrection, he would assume a very important role in the community. No. And one of them was, as we would find him in the Acts of the Apostles, presiding an important gathering of the disciples, the so-called First Council in Jerusalem, wherein they tackled important issues, like, for example, what would be the attitude, the requirements of the church in admitting new members coming from paganism. Should they become Jews first, meaning observe the laws of the Jews before being a Christian? For example, those are the issues. And we find him presiding over this council. And according to tradition, James was nicknamed the Just. No? And when Peter went off to proclaim the gospel in other parts of the world, James was elected as the leader of the local community of Christians in Jerusalem. And one historian by the name Eusebius, early church historian Eusebius, according to him, James was a Nazirite who from birth never drank alcohol nor ate meat, dressed simply, but dedicated himself to prayer and study. And probably for this reason that he enjoyed the esteem of his fellow apostles and Christians. Saint Philip, on the other hand, is more popular in the Gospels, in the Gospel accounts, as we have heard today in his intervention, for example, today. In the Gospel of St. John, we find specific instances and sympathetic stories about Philip. He was among the first disciples of Jesus. No? Disciples found by our Lord, and who was the first one to be called "Follow me" in the Gospel of John. Philip also would find a friend, Nathanael, no, and would recommend him, recommend or talk beautifully about Jesus to his friend as one about whom Moses in the law and the prophets wrote. He would testify to his friend Nathanael. Then repeats to his friend the same words of Jesus, "Come and see," no, inviting him to meet Jesus. We regard him as a person oriented and with a disposition toward sharing what he has found. A man ready to spread God's blessing in a generous way. Later traditions describe Philip as one who preached the gospel in Greece, in Syria, and Phrygia. Comparing the lives of these two saints, we realize that how diverse are the characteristics of these disciples, apostles, early leaders of the church. And we see that because of this, they enrich greatly the church in her vocation and mission. We find, for example, a stable, firm leadership of James in the community of Jerusalem, presiding over the council of the apostles in Jerusalem. As I've said, where they tackled important, critical issues at the beginning of the church. Same is true with Philip, no? One who brought people to Christ by giving them his testimony of what he had seen and experienced. It is important, I think, to realize that and to be reminded again and again of the richness of the church through the giftedness of its members. Thus, the church should be a venue for sharing one's gifts for the service of God, of Christ, and of His church. And it is so edifying to find communities, parishes, groups here in the shrine also, for example, to find lay collaborators now who are so passionate, generous in their commitment of serving the needs of the church, the community, in different projects, initiatives of the shrine, for example. These days, while we prepare for the elections, now, how many volunteers, young, old, members of the community, now, and it's so edifying to find them now are serving as PPCRB, people committed to the social services, our lay partners here, ministries in the Eucharistic celebrations, in the liturgy. Indeed, now, our giftedness as individual members of the church now can enrich greatly, enormously, the church. We as members of the church enrich our home, the church, with our presence, with our gifts, with our commitment. And may all of us realize our giftedness, and may we have that generosity and openness to share these gifts that we have to the community in general, and but in particular our Christian communities. The members, the leaders of the different groups are telling me, Father, dapat na tayong mag-recruit kasi maraming mga nawala na mga members ng ating ministries, no, mga nag-retire na o lumipat na at mga nauna na sa Panginoon. I think, Father, we need more readers, lectors, lay ministers, and other members of the ministries, choir. I think I am positive that God, who has bestowed upon us so many gifts, will not fail in enriching the community with the gifts of members. May we find the courage, the joy in giving, in sharing our gifts to our community. Amen.